Making wise decisions. When appointing spiritual leaders in the church, we are to develop a system that is fair, equitable, and discerning. Here's Gene.
There are three key words in this principle: fair, equitable, discerning. And you see, Timothy had a tremendous challenge in Ephesus to make wise decisions. But Paul immediately goes on to give him guidelines on how to make those wise decisions, to be fair and to be equitable and to be discerning. He said this, "I solemnly charge you." Now that's a strong statement. I mean, this is serious stuff. Timothy, I solemnly charge you before God and Christ Jesus and the elect angels to observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing out of favoritism. Whoa. That's a tremendous challenge. Now, we know who God is, and we know who Jesus Christ is, whom Paul cites here. I charge you before God and before Jesus Christ. Who are the angels, the elect angels? We're not sure, but it may refer to Gabriel. You remember Gabriel? We learn about Gabriel when he appeared to Mary, and he was identified as one who stands in the presence of God. That's a pretty serious role for an angel. It might refer to Michael, who's mentioned in Daniel. Michael means the protector of Israel, and he appears there in the book of Daniel in relationship to being a very important key angel in doing battle, really, against evil and against Satan, in protecting the children of Israel. We're not sure, but God says through Paul, this is serious because it's before God and it's before Jesus and it's before the elect angels. And here's the statement, basically: avoid prejudice and favoritism. Now, when he says here, observe these things, what is he referring to? Well, it could go all the way back to the beginning of the letter. In other words, he was to avoid prejudice and favoritism when confronting false teachers. Also, confronting angry men. Remember these men who were angry at the government? And God said through Paul to lift up holy hands in prayer. It could have been avoiding prejudice and favoritism when dealing with indiscreet women. That's a tough one. To do this without prejudice or to do this without favoritism. Confronting those who were seeking to be elders who were not qualified. We see that in chapter 3. It could refer to confronting those influenced by demons even. So here we have a statement, these things. In other words, I want you to observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing out of favoritism. However, I really think it refers primarily to those situations and those issues in chapter 5, because we are here in chapter 5. And you remember, he begins chapter 5 with this issue: avoid prejudice and favoritism, Timothy, when caring for widows who have material needs. Now that's a challenge. To do that objectively, without showing favoritism or prejudice. You see, when you show favoritism, it's for something, for someone. When you show prejudice, it's against someone. It's a two-sided, dimensional activity. And so can you imagine the challenge that Timothy had to avoid prejudice and not show favoritism? Another issue, do that when meeting the financial needs of elders. Wow, really be easy, wouldn't it, to show favoritism or prejudice, simply because of feelings that we might have. And Paul said, don't do that, Timothy. It could also refer to protecting elders, but also holding them accountable, which we looked at in the last principle. Protecting, holding accountable. Timothy had the responsibility to do that without being prejudiced and without showing favoritism. But I think specifically he's referring to appointing elders, because he goes immediately into a focus on elders in verse 22 when he says this: don't be too quick to appoint anyone as an elder, and don't share in the sins of others. And Timothy, make sure you keep yourself pure. Now, when you look at those three statements in relationship to what Paul has just admonished in terms of the way he deals with these people and appointments and so forth, he's just simply saying, Timothy, it takes time to really understand and really to know a person. So be careful. Don't do it quickly. Make sure that person is qualified. And he said, Timothy, you're going to be tempted because you're going to be dealing with a lot of situations. And so don't share in the sins of others. If they're moving in this direction, don't support them with favoritism or prejudice, but be objective. And he said, above all, don't allow yourself to engage in sexual immorality. And think about the challenge that young Timothy had. He's probably about 40 years of age, approximately. He's single, and he is surrounded with sexual immorality, visible sexual immorality. So you imagine the challenge this young man has. And yet, Paul is saying, Timothy, this is your responsibility. This is why I left you in Ephesus. I trust you. And you can handle it by God's grace. Now, the other interesting thing here is that what Paul is saying right here is an extension, really, of what he introduced us to back in chapter 3. And there was a principle that came out of chapter 3. I call this a profile for Christian maturity. Leaders who are appointed to serve in shepherding roles in the church are to be selected based on comprehensive biblical criteria for measuring Christian maturity. And you remember that there in chapter 3, Paul goes on with eldership to outline 15 qualities of maturity. And so what Paul is doing here in chapter 15 is an extension of what he introduced back there in chapter 3, with this principle of selecting qualified leaders. Now, it's fascinating that we have sort of a personal insert here. And I've tried to recreate what was going through Paul's mind when he said, Timothy, don't continue drinking only water, but use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. And I can just imagine Paul is sitting there writing, and it just grips him, and he says, whoa, I'm really laying a heavy load on this young man. And he's basically just taking a little break in the continuity, and he's saying, look, Timothy, I know this is tough. I know you've had some physical illnesses, and I know you're under incredible stress. And by the way, as you read all this, the stress, I can't even identify with it, what he was faced with and the challenges that he had there. And so consequently, Paul's being very practical. And he certainly isn't violating what he said about being addicted to wine. He's simply saying, take a little wine medicinally to help your problems, your physical problems, in particular stomach problems. If you know anything about stress, you know where stress ends up frequently, the focal point in your physical body, in your stomach. And that's the basis of ulcers. Here's an interesting question. You know, you go out and you eat a beef, a steak, and your stomach digests it, all the juices take care of that meat in your stomach. Have you ever wondered why your stomach doesn't digest itself? It will. It can. That's the basis of an ulcer. the stomach begins to digest itself because of the stress and the imbalance that comes through that stress. I remember my brother went to a doctor one time to deal with a situation and an ulcer, and the doctor said to him, Mike, he said, it's not what you're eating that's caused this ulcer. It's what's eating you, what you're troubled about, the stress. And he was right. And so Paul is being very practical here in relationship to this New Testament world, and is saying, in this case, a little wine could help you with your stress, with your illness, and with the problems that you're facing. But then he says, in essence, but, Timothy, it's a reality. Welcome to the family of God. Welcome to the ministry. We got to keep going on. And so he gives 4 guidelines in relationship to carrying out this responsibility regarding the appointment of elders. He says, first of all, Timothy, realize that some people's sins are obvious, preceding them to judgment. That's why, Timothy, you need to very carefully use that list of qualifications to measure the lifestyle of these individuals. Secondly, he said, Timothy, but the sins of others surface later. In other words, this is the most difficult thing because people can be very shrewd in hiding their sins. And at the right moment, in the place of power and position, it emerges. And that's why Paul said to Timothy, take your time. Take your time. Make sure this individual is mature in Christ. Thirdly, he says, likewise, good works are obvious. They are. And you can see them and you can watch them. And that's the basis of the criteria. The good works that result from character. The good works that result from character. And then fourthly, he says, those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden. In other words, in essence, again, he's saying good character will manifest good works. It will happen. So here, Paul is giving guidelines to Timothy in relationship, particularly to the appointing of elders or spiritual leaders in the church. Leads to a reflection and response question. In what way does Paul's final word, that good works are obvious, affirm the need to use the list of qualifications in 1 Timothy 3, 1-13, in selecting spiritual leaders, in this case, elders? Well, one thing it says is that this is the criteria for measuring maturity. But it's also implying that we need appropriate methodology. Now, the interesting thing is that God, through the Spirit, through Paul, does not give us the methodology. It gives us the guidelines so that we can apply this principle in any culture of the world. But we need to develop a methodology to make sure that we carry out these biblical injunctions that Paul was giving to this young man, Timothy. And that methodology will vary from culture to culture in different situations. But we'll need a methodology. And one of the things that I think we need to look for, by implication, is faithful service over a period of time. When someone is ministering to people really sincerely, it will reveal their character, their true character, over a period of time. If there's hidden sin, it'll come to the surface. If there's weakness in the marriage because of inappropriate attitudes, it will surface, particularly in the context of ministry. And by the way, one thing I've learned, you don't want to put a couple, a husband and wife, in ministry if there are cracks in their marriage, because what you'll do is set them up for failure. And Satan will take advantage of that every time. And so that's why it's so important that we measure, I think, maturity for both men and women who are going to serve in these leadership roles. In our own situation, we basically have said we want you to be faithful at ministering to a group of people over a period of time. To really test, number one, is this what you want to do? And secondly, to test whether or not this person is growing or these people are growing in their faith in Jesus Christ. And also, another thing in our culture is we just simply prepared an outline or a questionnaire based upon these qualities. And those who were open to being in spiritual leadership knew all about it. And then we had asked people that knew them the best to fill out a questionnaire to see to what extent they measure up to maturity. So there are a lot of ways that we can apply these principles, but we must apply these principles. In this case, let me just summarize the principle that we have here growing from this passage. When appointing spiritual leaders in the church, we're to develop a system that is fair, equitable, and discerning.